Assalamu alaikum guys, this is Ahmed Mauer aka Mr. Middlepath, and this is a quick introduction into what we're going to be covering throughout these three-part series on weed use throughout Muslim history and the distinction between Muslim history and Islamic history. Islamic history being the history that we take that is sacred, that Muslims can form religious rulings out of and use those events to make a legal interpretation out of that. Such events would obviously be the life of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It also includes, but is not limited to, the founding generations, most of what they did and much of what the actions that they made and that they said. Most Muslims, almost all Muslims, would consider that as sacred, and you can extract religious rulings from that. There are other events as well that Muslims would consider as part of Islamic history, and Islamic history and Muslim history overlap. It's not like bang, this is Islamic history, bang, that's Muslim history. No, they overlap with each other. Muslim history, though, would be things that, for better or for worse, the actions of Muslim people, for better or for worse, that is just, it's not sacred. You're not going to take a religious ruling out of it, even if it's for the better. And if it's for the worse, then, that's still irrelevant. That's still Muslim history. Now, that being said, that's why I chose the name weed use throughout Muslim history, because I didn't want people to think that, oh, it's okay to smoke weed in Islam, or like some other, I don't know what people think about when they watch these videos. So that's why it was very important for me to put this intro out. And part one, we'll talk about a general overview of the history that the Muslim Ummah went through. When exactly in this history did weed use start to become known, and in what form was it consumed in, and how did the doctors use it? Because at first it was introduced as a medicine, and this was introduced 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So again, how the scholars looked at it, because this was something new that they didn't have access to before, so they didn't know how to put a ruling on it, and what decisions they made to make the ruling on it. Nowadays, obviously, all scholars think that weed use is forbidden. How did the scholars view it in the past is something that will be looked at a little bit in part one, but mainly in part two. Part two will also go into more about what the scientists viewed it as, and then we'll cover in part one and part two. Part one will cover mainly the general history, but part two will also cover how the poor people viewed it, and also how some poets viewed it and what they wrote about it as well. Part three will go into a more interesting section where how the rulers and the warrior classes viewed it and the soldiers viewed it and what they did. So an example would be a king that thought that weed use was hurting the effectiveness of his troops. I mentioned who that was and what his accomplishments were and the edicts that he made and what the effects were. And then we try and move up all the way till present day. In present day, obviously, weed use is still a problem in Muslim societies and in non-Muslim societies as well. And the conversations that people were having about weed today are very similar to the conversations that were happening back then. And we're going to go into more depth and more detail in that, inshallah, right now. Without further ado, let us begin. Assalamu alaikum guys, this is Mr. Middlepath aka Ahmed Mauer, or Ahmed Mauer aka Mr. Middlepath, however you want to perceive me as. So anyways, this is part three of weed use in Muslim history. And I talked earlier about how the scholars viewed it, how the doctors viewed it, and now I want to talk, and how poets viewed it. And now I want to talk a little bit about how the ruling class viewed it and how the common people viewed it and why it became so widespread. So Ibn Battuta, who was a famous traveler from Morocco, traveled all over the Muslim world, and he was around 1300 AD. So 1300 AD, just to put that into perspective for you, 1200 was around the time of the Mamluks, Mamluk dynasty, which I talked about in part one. 1099, around 1000 AD. Sorry, my brain here. Around 1000 AD was Crusades, right? 1100 AD was the Crusades, right? And Salah ad-Din time after that, and then the Mamluks after that. Around 1200 is the Mamluks time. Just to give you guys a idea, okay? So Ibn Battuta was around 1348 was 1348 AD. Okay, so he traveled and he noticed two things. One, alcohol use, despite the fact that it's forbidden in Islam, was widespread amongst the upper classes. This was a time that the Muslim world was fragmented and extremely corrupt, right? And you will read about how rulers would quite frequently cross and double cross each other to remain in power. and I'll talk about this later. Hash use was frequent among the poor people. As I said in part 1, it was called the grass of the poor. It was just a little bit, and you put it in a napkin, and you put it in your pocket, and you eat it. So widespread, in fact, that he said that people would eat it in the mosques. That's how common it became, despite the fact that all of the scholars had said that it's forbidden, except in limited medicinal use. But people being people, they abuse their drugs and they abuse their medicines, and they take it outside of its intended use, and when that happens, problems occur. So anyways, we have, give me a moment here, we have the Mamluk dynasty, and I'm going to talk about King Baybar. King Baybar he was not the founder of the Mamluk dynasty, but people say that he was considered a founder. The Mamluks were essentially slave warriors. So they were people who would be bought as slaves, as young boys, and they would be trained in warfare to the point that they were like beasts, and they would be sent out as soldiers to like the most difficult missions. And eventually these slave warriors overthrew their masters and they became the kings, right? So interesting there. During this time, around the 1200s, was the Mongol invasions, where the Abbasid dynasty was taken over, and they were coming into Egypt. And Sayyid Qutuz was the leader of the Mamluks at the time. And the Mongols said, hey, we took over. We've been crushing everybody. We took over everything. So, and we're gonna take over Egypt too. He was a Mamluk. Mamluks were usually from the Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Turkish area, right, and above there, and slaves from there. And anyways, so there would be like blonde hair, blue eyes, that type of warrior. So, but they were Muslim as well, obviously. So, Sayyid Qutuz kills the two Mongolian emissaries, kills the two Mongolian messengers, and hangs their bodies on the walls to let everyone know, because everyone thought that the Mongols were invincible at this time. Oh my God, the Mongols are coming. What do we do? So he did that to kind of show, like, these guys are humans just like we are. It's going down, right? We're gonna take you guys out. So and like I said, the Mamluks were slave warriors, so they were from birth. They were trained to be the best warriors that you could possibly have. They were like the elite troops. So if anything, if anyone could stop them, it was these guys. So they meet the Mongols at a place called Ain Jalut, which is in Palestine. Ain Jalut means Goliath's well. So you have the story of David and Goliath. David is Dawood Sayyidina Dawood alayhi salam. Goliath is Jalut in the Quran. لا طاقة لنا اليوم بجالوت وجنوده. The Israelite soldiers are telling Talut, the king Talut with a T, not Jalut, who's the Goliath with a Jim. They're saying we don't have any energy for Jalut and his troops. And then the other soldiers saying, don't you have faith? How many times in history have people of a small force being a big force? And they fight, and Dawood alayhi salam, Sayyidina Dawood alayhi salam, David famously kills Goliath with a sling. So that area is called Goliath's well. And Allah knows best if that area really was the place where Goliath fought David, peace be upon him, or if it was just an area that people named it later, and we don't know, But that was the area where the Mamluks and the Mongolians fought each other. So anyways, what worked out in the Muslims' favor was that back in the homeland, China and Mongol, and where the Mongols' seat of power was, the king had died, and they were fighting over power. So the general sends most of his troops back to take care of that situation, and he leaves what he perceives to be enough troops to he perceives them to be enough troops to defeat the Mamluks, and it obviously didn't work out. So the Mamluks attack. Sayyid Qutuz hides his... I'm going way off topic here, but just bear with me, guys. Sayyid Qutuz hides his troops, his cavalry, the horsemen, in the hills, alright? And he sends out a little bit of a force to meet with the Mongolians, and they just run in, they rush in, they're like, yeah, we're gonna get this guy, right? And out of nowhere, the horses come out from around the hills, swarm the Mongols, and defeat them. And this was considered a decisive victory it crushed the illusion that the Mongols were invincible, and they were able to push back and reconquer areas, and many of the Mongols converted to Islam as well and fought against the homeland. And that's a story for a different time. Sayyid Qutuz was killed by one of his troops, Baybar, who became the king, called al-Malik al-Zahir, or the obvious king, or the conquering king, right? And he issued a strict no weed, no alcohol policy. And the reason I'm bringing all this history thing up is so that you can see how the soldiers and the kings viewed it. It's like, because he was concerned that weed use was hurting the effectiveness of his troops, and he didn't want it to make them weak. Like I said, poets said that this kind of stuff made people cowardly or slow and lazy. Doctors said that prolonged use made people socially awkward and sapped them of their will to work, and the ruling class also didn't like it. Okay, so anyways, Baybar was also a very famous soldier too. He had the famous tactic of, okay, I'm not gonna go into that. That's a different topic. Okay, so anyways, as you can see, Baybar kills Sayyid Qutuz, right? Murders him and takes the seat of power. So we can assume fairly reasonably that this was a corrupt period of the Muslim history, even though there were warriors and perhaps they were not living up to the highest manifestation of Islamic values that they should have, right? So during this time, what do the poor people do when there's a lot of corruption? They smoke weed and they complain about it, like we do today. Oh my God, the Freemasons, man, they're controlling everything. Oh, look how corrupt the government is. Oh, blah, blah, I'm just gonna smoke weed and complain about it. Back then, apparently they did the same thing, and the grass of the poor was consumed in abundance, and people tried to stop it, and rulers would try and effectively stop its use, but they had trouble doing it. It was difficult to do because you can stamp out the weed use, the hash eating, but you can't. But you're just covering up the problem. The hash use is coming from a deeper symptom, the corruption of society. So, and if the ruler himself is corrupt, then anything he's doing is like he's just plugging up a hole and the water is coming out, and then he plugs that hole up and the water like blasts out from another area. So they had a lot of trouble controlling this, right? So they would eat their hash, and it was kind of interesting that through observation they viewed hash use as, synonymous with poor, low-class people that would eat it, who didn't have any worldly power or any say in society, right? That's the video. Comment below if you have any questions, and I'm going to talk. Next part coming up is the current scientific views on marijuana use, and then after that I want to talk about my personal observations on marijuana, and then finally how to quit. Take care, guys. Peace out. Assalamu alaikum.